SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning, my dear students, and welcome to an hour-long lecture on comedy as a literary form. I'm sure all of you are aware that when we think of drama, we think of two major divisions. We think of tragedy and we think of comedy. And all of you know that much before the other forms of literature came into effect, we had the comedy and the tragedy. Drama was one of the most ancient, along with poetry, one of the most ancient forms of literature all over the world. Not merely in England, where it came much later, but all over the world. What do we mean by comedy? We say it is a way of looking at the world in which basic values are associated, but natural laws are suspended to underscore human follies and foolishness. Do understand, what creates laughter, my dear students? It's always somebody's folly, somebody's flaw, somebody's defect, somebody's foible. This is what creates laughter. And of course, it can be foolishness also. When you find people doing things which are very odd, which are obviously stupid, which are unintelligent, then one feels like laughing. And this laughter could be wry, could be a very funny kind of humor, could be hilarious where you want to laugh your heart out. And it could be rueful. Rueful, my dear students, means, where there's a little element of sorrow, sadness that this happened, but you're still laughing. It's like when you find somebody slipping and maybe falling, there is a bit of laughter, but with a little bit of sorrow, sadness that maybe the person could have got hurt. It is a genre. I want you to notice that the word, because it's a French word, is pronounced genre. And genre means literary form. We use the word literary form, but the more technical word is genre. Now, it's a genre of dramatic literature. As I just mentioned at the beginning, we generally divide drama into tragedy and comedy. And of course, you can have many more. Like you can have melodrama, you can have historical plays. But if you have to divide it into two simple ones, then it would be tragedy and comedy. So it is a form of dramatic literature that deals with the light and amusing. Or it could even deal with the serious and the profound. But what is important is the manner in which it is done. And what is the manner? It's a light, familiar, or satirical manner. You get that? What the topic is, what the theme is only one part of the comedy. The more important thing is, how is it being dealt with? To attempt to define any form of literature, in fact, to attempt to define anything is very difficult. That is true of literature. That is true of also all the forms of literature. So when we attempt to define comedy as a literary form, I thought I'll give you an idea of what different ages felt about comedy as a literary form. Let me take you to the Elizabethan age. And of course, you know Sir Philip Sidney. You know that we consider him a poet, but you also know that we think of him as a critic. All of us remember his great reply to Gausson's criticism of poetry. We remember his work called The Defense of Poetry. Poesy, as it was called in those days, poetry, as we call it today. He says, comedy is an imitation of the common errors of our life. Every human being, when he watches a comedy, when he reads a comedy, he does think of how this error has been seen earlier. It's not something unusual. It's not something that has never happened before or will never happen again. It is a common error of life. Our lives, that means we can easily relate to it. And remember, all literature is an imitation of life, of reality. So Sir Philip Sidney, the important writer of the Elizabethan age, attempts to define comedy as an imitation of the common errors of our life. What does Horace Walpole say many years later? he tries to understand comedy and tragedy and the contrast between the two. So what does he say? The world is a comedy to those that think and a tragedy to those that feel. So according to him, emotions are more important in a tragedy and thinking is more important. That does not mean that comedy is a more intellectual form of drama. It only means that there is less appeal to the emotions in a comedy than there is in a tragedy. Let's come to something which is much, much lighter, and which is by Lord Byron, the famous romantic poet. And what does he have to say? He says, all tragedies are finished by a death. I think we would agree with that. We only have to think of all the great Shakespearean tragedies of which you are familiar. You have to think of Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello and King Lear and the entire list. And what happens at the end of a tragedy? It finishes in a death. And generally, the death of the protagonist, the death of the hero, the death of the important character. And we notice that when we use the word tragedy, we immediately assume that it should end in death, because that is the greatest tragedy that is shown in any literature. And what happens to comedy? How does the comedy end? He says it very well when he says comedy should end in a marriage. Comedy should end in a marriage is what he says. All's well that ends well, right? And they lived happily ever after. You think of the fairy tale endings and then you feel, yes, the comedy. This is what the comedy is all about. When and where did comedy as a dramatic form, as a literary form begin? My dear students, I'm sure, as students of English literature, you're all aware that when we talk of the beginnings, we have Chaucer, but that's not where literature began. And so we go to Europe and we go to European literature. And when we go to European literature, the earliest beginnings are always in Greece or in Rome, more in Greece than in Rome. Think of the first critic that you know. Think of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and you will know what I'm talking about. We have to go to Greece. And what is the word which gave birth to the English word comedy? It's a Greek word. The Greek word komos, K-O-M-O-S. It was actually a celebration in the village, a village revelry, and usually a feast to the wine god Dionysus. What happens? A group of villagers get together. They are in a happy mood. They sing and dance after having a little bit of wine, and that is komos. From commerce, we gradually moved on to the English word comedy. If I have to talk to you about the beginnings of comedy, and if I'm telling you that it all began in Greece with a small village revelry, I cannot but draw your attention to the major writers of that period. That period is about 2000 years ago, more than 2000 years ago, my dear students. We are thinking of a period when already there was drama, there was comedy in Greece, much, much before English literature began. We have to go to that period because it is from there that the literary form that today we call comedy arrived in England. So let's go to the earliest beginning and try and think of some of the writers, some of the names: Aristophanes, Menander, Plautus, Terence. Now these are the important comedy writers that we think of. And when we think of these comedy writers, the tragedy writer Seneca immediately comes to mind because we talk of Senecan tragedy. But today, of course, I'm going to talk to you about comedy. So let's talk about the kind of comedies that these people wrote. We're talking of Aristophanes and Menander, and we're talking about Plautus and Terence. We could say that they had action comedies. They had comedies which ridiculed and satirized. They also had that kind of comedy which later gave birth to what we call the comedy of manners, about which I'm going to talk to you when we talk about Restoration comedy. But that will come later. So we are right at the beginning of comedy, which was in Greece, where you had writers like Aristophanes and Menander and Plautus and Terence, the early beginnings. From there, let's move to England. And the period that I'm talking about now is the 14th century, the 15th century. Remember, we are trying to see how comedy reached the form in which we understand comedy as a part of drama, as a kind of dramatic literature, as a genre of drama. And then we come now to the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries England. I want you to understand that at this period, we had different kinds of plays. The kind of drama that we know today had not yet been born in England. So what did we see then? We had the moralities, the mystery plays, the miracles, and the interludes. My dear students, I'm talking about the beginning of drama, of comedy as we know it today. So what were these plays? These were performed by small groups of people. Actually, they had a wagon and they would take it from place to place. These were performed by the guilds. That is, you would have a group of carpenters maybe performing. You would have a group of other kinds of workmen, shoemakers, cobblers. You would have different kinds of people, groups within their guilds, and they would move from one area to another. Something like the street plays of today, which appeals to the people who have just collected round a crowd on the road, on the street, and they enjoy that. So these plays in those days were like that. What did they do? They had a particular idea, a particular value, a particular virtue which they wanted to highlight. And these were the moralities. Then we move on to the mystery plays and the miracle plays, which were actually from the stories from the Bible. Stories which were well known to the people who were watching the play. But at the same time, it held their interest because of the way in which it was being staged. Even to use the word stage, my dear students, is wrong because there was no stage. As I told you, it would probably be a cart, and they would stand on the cart and they would perform, and the cart would go from place to place. Around the same time, you have another kind of drama which is called the interlude. You know the English word interval, right? Between two acts, you could have an interval. You're watching a movie, there is an interval between the first half of the movie and the second half of the movie. Now, the interlude is something like that. It is a very short play which is performed either before the main play or between two acts of the main play. Later, the one-act plays developed from the interludes, but that is not our topic today. But remember, a beautiful one-act play like Monkey's Paw was once written as an interlude, but the play was such a success that it gradually became the main play. There are many one-act plays like that, but that's much later. That's the 20th century, and I'm still with you in the 14th and 15th century. We have still not reached Elizabethan drama. We have not yet reached the Renaissance. I'm talking before that. It is that at that period that the moralities, the miracle plays, the mystery plays, and the interludes were very much in fashion, performed by a small group of people, as I told you, by guilds, probably with very little stage, makeup, costume, etc. But they had good dialogue delivery, and the topics, the themes that they were dealing with were what the common man understood. And that is why they were great success. Let us move on now to the Renaissance. Remember that whenever we talk about English literature, whenever we talk about the growth of English literature, we begin by talking about the Renaissance, because this was the revival of learning. After 1,000 years that we call the Dark Ages, from the 4th century to the 14th century, once again there was an awakening. Students of literature have to remember words like Renaissance and Reformation, because we see directly or indirectly the effect of these two major movements in Europe in the literature that we study, in English literature in particular. There are two comedies which are referred to. You would never be studying them, but probably you will be looking at them as an acquaintance factor when you look at what's happening in the beginnings of comedy in English language. Because remember, we began with Greek, and now I've come to England, and I'm talking to you about what was happening in the Renaissance period. At that stage, we have two important plays that we generally talk about, and that is Ralph Roister Doister and Gammer Gurton's Needle. Simple plays, but plays which would make you smile, plays which would make you laugh, plays which will take you to the age in which it was written. Because remember, drama is always a representation of the age in which it is written. So we get quaint pictures of the kind of life that Englishmen lived in those times. And from there, it is one big leap to Elizabethan drama. No student of literature can ever say she does not know what Elizabethan drama is all about. Because one of the greatest playwrights of the entire world, one of the greatest playwrights of all times, lived and wrote in this period. Of course, I'm talking about William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon. But I'll talk about his plays later. Before that, very quickly, let's see what was Elizabethan drama all about. Remember, you had the university wits. Remember, you had Kidd and Marlowe and Johnson, who used to make fun of Shakespeare because he didn't even have a school education. Forget a university education. And later critics referred to these people as the university wits, referred to in a slightly sarcastic way, in a slightly ironic way, because this school dropout later became one of the greatest playwrights of all time, William Shakespeare. I want to make a passing reference here, my dear students, to Sanskrit drama. I'm talking about comedy. I'm talking about comedy as a literary form. I'm talking about English literature. But I cannot but mention what was happening in Sanskrit drama in the early years, in the early centuries AD. What was the kind of drama that was being written here? It's very intriguing. It's very interesting to note that Sanskrit drama does not have any tragedy the way we understand tragedy in English drama, in English literature, in European literature. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Sanskrit plays did not end with the death of the hero, because all plays ended